The November rain hammered against the windows of the Westbrook Police Department, a persistent gray drizzle that matched the mood of the sleepy town. Detective Claire Morrison sat alone in the evidence room, surrounded by dusty boxes and cold cases nobody cared about anymore. Transferred from the chaos of Boston 6 months ago, she still wasn't used to the silence. In Boston, there was always something happening. Here, the loudest sound was the ticking clock on the wall. So when her phone rang at 7:13 p.m., she almost welcomed the interruption. The voice on the other end was young, nervous, and slightly out of breath. A body at the old Vance property on Mirror Lake. Elliot Vance was dead. Claire knew the name immediately. Everyone in Westbrook knew Elliot Vance. He was the closest thing this town had to royalty. A retired investment advisor who had cashed out at the perfect time, he had spent the last 15 years dedicated to philanthropy. His name was on the new library wing, the scholarship fund at the high school, and the annual Thanksgiving food drive that fed hundreds of families. When the mill closed and people lost their jobs, Elliot wrote checks. When the fire destroyed 3 homes on Elm Street, Elliot paid for the rebuilding. He was the man people called when they had nowhere else to turn. To the 3,000 residents of Westbrook, Elliot Vance was a living saint. And now, someone had killed him. Claire drove her unmarked sedan through the winding roads, the tires splashing through puddles that reflected the flashing blue lights in the distance. The Vance property was a sprawling estate on the lake, beautiful but completely isolated. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away. As she pulled up, the crime scene unit was already setting up portable floodlights that cast long, harsh shadows across the wet lawn. The cabin itself was rustic but elegant, all dark wood and stone. The air inside was warm and smelled of old books and leather. The forensic team led her downstairs to the wine cellar. And that was where she found him. The wine cellar was a perfect cylinder of ancient stone, lined floor to ceiling with racks of expensive bottles that probably cost more than Claire's monthly salary. In the center of the room, Elliot Vance lay on his back, dressed in a comfortable cardigan and wool slippers. He looked peaceful, almost asleep, if not for the single, precise wound in the center of his chest. There was very little blood, which told Claire something important. The wound had been delivered carefully, deliberately, probably with a thin blade that found his heart on the first try. This wasn't a panicked attack. This was an execution. There were no signs of a struggle. The furniture was undisturbed. The bottles on the racks were perfectly aligned. Elliot's expensive watch still circled his wrist, and his leather wallet sat thick in his back pocket. This wasn't robbery. Whoever killed him came for one reason only. On the small tasting table in the corner, Claire noticed something that made her pause. 2 crystal glasses sat side by side, both with a small amount of red wine remaining at the bottom. Elliot Vance had been sharing a drink with his murderer. He had trusted this person enough to bring them into his private sanctuary, pour them his best wine, and turn his back. That trust had cost him his life. The medical examiner arrived an hour later and confirmed what Claire already suspected. Time of death was approximately 6 hours before she arrived, placing it in the early afternoon. The killer had walked out of this house in broad daylight, driven away from the lake, and disappeared into the November rain without anyone noticing a thing. Claire stood in the cellar long after the body was removed, studying the 2 glasses. One set of fingerprints would belong to Elliot. The other set would belong to a killer. She just had to find them. As she turned to leave, she noticed something else. Behind one of the wine racks, barely visible, a single security camera watched the room. Someone had been recording everything. The news of Elliot Vance's death spread through Westbrook like wildfire. By morning, the gate of his property was buried under flowers, candles, and handwritten notes from grieving residents. Local news trucks parked along the road, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky as reporters delivered somber updates. Claire watched it all from her office window, sipping cold coffee and trying to separate the man from the myth. Her first task was to understand who Elliot Vance really was. She started at the Vance Foundation office on Main Street, a charming brick building with a polished brass sign. The staff was devastated. His personal assistant, a timid woman named Patricia who had worked for him for 10 years, could barely speak without breaking down. He was the best man she had ever known, she said. He paid for her son's college tuition when her husband lost his job. He never asked for anything in return. He just wanted to help. Patricia explained that the foundation operated simply. People in need would submit requests, and Elliot would review them personally. If he approved, the money would appear. Sometimes in checks, sometimes in cash, always without fanfare. He didn't believe in bureaucracy, Patricia said. He believed in people. Over the next 2 days, Claire interviewed a parade of grateful citizens. There was the mechanic whose father's cancer treatment had been fully covered. The single mother who received a down payment for a small house. The baker who kept her business alive during the pandemic with an interest-free loan. Each story was more heartwarming than the last. Each person described Elliot as kind, generous, and humble. He never wanted recognition, they all said. He just wanted to make Westbrook a better place. By the third day, Claire had a stack of testimonies that painted a picture of a man who was practically a saint. And yet, something bothered her. The stories were consistent. Too perfect. And none of them could explain where the money came from. Claire requested access to the Vance Foundation's financial records. The foundation was a registered nonprofit, which meant their books should be transparent and accessible. What she found made no sense at all. According to the official documents, the foundation had been operating with virtually no funds for the past 5 years. The bank accounts were nearly empty. There were no large donations, no investment income, nothing that could explain the hundreds of thousands of dollars that Elliot had apparently given away. And yet everyone Claire interviewed had confirmed receiving their money. So where had it come from? She called in a forensic accountant, a quiet man named David Chin who had worked for the FBI before retiring to a small farm outside town. David spent 3 days buried in paperwork, cross-referencing accounts, tracking transactions, following digital trails that led nowhere. On the 4th day, he walked into Claire's office with a stack of papers and a very strange look on his face. The money existed, he said. It just didn't come from the foundation. Elliot Vance had been funding his philanthropy through a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and what appeared to be personal investments. The money was real. But its origin was deliberately, carefully hidden. Claire stared at the papers on her desk. Why would a philanthropist hide where his money came from? If he had earned it legitimately, there would be no reason for secrecy. The only explanation was that the money came from somewhere he didn't want anyone to know about. She thought about the 2 glasses in the wine cellar, the careful precision of the wound, the lack of struggle. Elliot Vance had secrets. And one of those secrets had walked into his home, shared a drink with him, and ended his life. She just had to figure out what that secret was before the trail went completely cold. Claire shifted her investigation to Elliot's past, long before he became the saint of Westbrook. She requested personnel files from the investment firm where he had worked in Boston, a company called Sterling Capital that had once been a major player in the financial world. The files arrived digitally, hundreds of pages of performance reviews, client lists, and internal communications. Elliot had worked at Sterling for nearly 20 years, rising from junior analyst to senior partner. He had been respected, successful, and apparently very good at his job. Then, 15 years ago, he had retired suddenly and moved to Westbrook. The timing caught Claire's attention. 6 months after Elliot's departure, Sterling Capital had dissolved. The founder, a man named Richard Sterling, had died in a boating accident off the coast of Maine. The official report ruled it an accident, but there were inconsistencies. Richard had been an experienced sailor. The weather that day had been calm. His boat had been found intact, floating empty near a rocky shoreline. And $2 million from a life insurance policy had been paid out to an anonymous beneficiary. Claire requested the full case file from the Maine authorities. It took 3 days to arrive, and when she opened it, she found something that made her heart skip. The beneficiary of Richard Sterling's insurance policy had never been identified. The payment was made to a trust, and the trust was protected by layers of legal secrecy. But one name appeared in the paperwork as the trustee. A name she recognized. Elliot Vance. Elliot hadn't just worked for Richard Sterling. He had been positioned to inherit everything. And 6 months later, he had moved to Westbrook with enough money to become a full-time philanthropist. Claire returned to the list of people Elliot had helped over the past 15 years. There were dozens of names, each with a heartwarming story attached. But this time, she looked at them differently. She wasn't looking for gratitude anymore. She was looking for patterns. She started with basic background checks, pulling public records on every recipient. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds, court filings. It was tedious work, but after 3 days, a pattern began to emerge. Every single person Elliot had helped shared one common trait. Before receiving his assistance, each of them had experienced an unexpected financial windfall. The mechanic whose father's cancer treatment was covered? His father had received a life insurance payout 6 months earlier. The single mother with the house down payment? Her late husband had left her a modest inheritance from a distant relative. The baker who kept her business afloat? She had settled a workplace injury lawsuit for $70,000. In every case, the amounts ranged from $50,000 to $200,000. And within months of receiving this money, they had all encountered Elliot Vance. Claire sat back in her chair, staring at the wall. The implications were staggering. Elliot hadn't been giving these people his own money. He had been using their money. But that didn't make sense either. If he had taken their money, they would have noticed. They would have been angry. They would have gone to the police. Unless he hadn't taken it all. Unless he had taken just enough that they didn't notice, and then given them back a portion using someone else's funds. It was a perfect cycle. An endless loop of stolen money disguised as generosity. Claire understood now. Elliot Vance had been running a sophisticated operation for 15 years. He would identify people who had received unexpected money, often from traumatic events like deaths or accidents. These people were vulnerable, grieving, and uncertain about their sudden wealth. Elliot would approach them gently, offering friendship, guidance, and financial advice. He would offer to help them manage their money, protect it from taxes, invest it safely. They trusted him because he seemed kind, because he asked for nothing, because he was Elliot Vance, the saint of Westbrook. Then, slowly, he would help himself. He would transfer small amounts to his own accounts, amounts so small the victims never noticed. $50,000 missing from a $200,000 inheritance? They assumed they had spent it. A bad investment? They trusted Elliot when he said the market was unpredictable. And to keep them grateful, to keep them quiet, he would give some of that stolen money to other victims. The mechanic's father got cancer treatment funded by the baker's settlement. The single mother got her house funded by the mechanic's inheritance. Nobody knew they were part of a giant web of theft disguised as charity. The victims didn't even know they were victims. They believed Elliot had saved them. In reality, he had simply returned a portion of what he had taken, using other people's money to do it. It was brilliant, really. Untraceable. Invisible. For 15 years, Elliot had lived like a king while his victims remained grateful prisoners in his web. Claire thought about the 2 glasses in the wine cellar. Someone had finally figured it out. Someone had discovered the truth and decided to make him pay. She just had to find out who. Claire went back through the files, looking for anyone who might have discovered the truth. She focused on cases where the amounts were largest, where the victims might have been more suspicious. One name stood out immediately. Sarah Mitchell. 10 years ago, Sarah had received a settlement of $300,000 after a workplace accident left her with permanent injuries. She had been 32 years old, a single mother with a young daughter. According to the records, Elliot had helped her invest the money. 3 years later, Sarah Mitchell had died in a car accident in Canada. Her daughter had gone to live with relatives in another state. Case closed. But something about the file bothered Claire. She requested the accident report from Canadian authorities. It arrived 2 days later, and the moment she read it, she knew something was wrong. The accident had occurred on a remote highway in British Columbia. Sarah's car had gone off the road and plunged into a ravine. The car had burned. The body was identified through dental records. But there were no witnesses. No other vehicles involved. And the dental records had been provided by Elliot Vance. Claire's heart pounded. Elliot had identified the body. Elliot had closed the loop. What if Sarah Mitchell hadn't died in that accident? What if she had discovered what Elliot was doing and decided to disappear? What if she had faked her own death to escape him, or worse, to hunt him? Claire requested a photograph of Sarah Mitchell from before the accident. When it arrived, she studied the face of a woman with dark hair and tired eyes. A woman who had lost everything and trusted the wrong person. A woman who was supposedly dead. And then she requested the fingerprints from the crime scene. The fingerprint analysis came back on a Tuesday morning. Claire was in her office when the email arrived, and she opened it with hands that trembled slightly. The prints from the second wine glass in Elliot Vance's cellar had been processed and run through the national database. There was a match. The name on the screen made Claire's breath catch in her throat. Sarah Mitchell. For a long moment, Claire just stared at the screen. Sarah Mitchell was supposed to be dead. She had been declared dead 5 years ago. Her body had been identified, buried, mourned. And yet her fingerprints were fresh on a wine glass in a murder victim's home. Either the Canadian authorities had made a terrible mistake, or Sarah Mitchell had deliberately vanished and was very much alive. Claire pulled up the accident file again, reading every detail with fresh eyes. The remote highway. The burning car. The dental records provided by Elliot himself. It was all too convenient. Elliot had known Sarah was a threat. She had probably confronted him, demanded her money back, threatened to expose him. So he had helped her disappear. But why? Why not just kill her? Unless he couldn't. Unless killing her would have drawn too much attention. So instead, he gave her a way out. A new identity. A new life. Far away from Westbrook. And in return, she would stay quiet. It was a deal. But deals have a way of falling apart. Claire requested a current photo of Sarah Mitchell from the DMV records before her death. She studied the face carefully, memorizing every detail. Somewhere out there, this woman was alive. And she had been in Elliot's wine cellar the night he died. Claire began the slow, painstaking work of finding a woman who officially didn't exist. She contacted the Canadian authorities who had handled the accident investigation. They were defensive at first, insisting their work was thorough. But when Claire presented the fingerprint evidence, they grew quiet. The dental records had come from Elliot Vance, they admitted. They had no reason to doubt them. If Elliot had provided false records, the entire investigation was compromised. Sarah Mitchell's death was a fiction. She expanded the search, looking for any trace of Sarah in the years after her supposed death. No credit cards, no property records, no employment history. She had simply vanished. But people don't disappear completely. They leave traces. Footprints in the digital world. Claire requested bank records from accounts associated with Sarah before her death. There was one small transaction that caught her eye. 3 months after the accident, a small payment had been made to a storage facility in a town called Millbrook, about 200 miles from Westbrook. The payment was made in cash, so there was no name attached. But the facility was within driving distance of where Sarah had last been seen. Claire drove to Millbrook the next day. The storage facility was a sprawling complex of metal garages on the edge of town. The manager was an elderly man who remembered very little, but he did have records. Unit 47 had been rented 10 years ago by a woman named Sarah. The payments had been made in cash, every 3 months, like clockwork. The last payment was made 2 weeks ago. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. Sarah Mitchell was still alive. She was still nearby. And she had been here recently, probably to retrieve something. Probably to prepare for what she was about to do. Claire obtained a warrant for Unit 47. When the door rolled up, she found a small space filled with boxes and furniture, the remnants of a life abandoned. But one box stood out. It was newer than the others, placed on top of a dusty dresser. Inside, Claire found a notebook. It was Sarah's diary, spanning the last 10 years. The early entries were filled with confusion and fear. She had discovered that Elliot was stealing from her, siphoning small amounts from her settlement over 2 years. When she confronted him, he didn't deny it. Instead, he offered her a deal. He would help her disappear, give her enough money to start over, and in return, she would never speak to anyone about what he had done. She had agreed. She had been terrified and alone. She had no other options. But the later entries changed. Sarah wrote about watching Elliot from afar, about the rage that grew inside her over the years. She had discovered that she wasn't his only victim. She had found others, talked to them, realized the full scope of what he had done. He had destroyed lives while playing the saint. And he had gotten away with it for 15 years. The final entry was dated the day before Elliot's death. It was short. Just 3 words. Tonight, it ends. Claire closed the notebook and looked around the storage unit. Sarah had been here. She had planned this carefully, waited patiently, and then walked into Elliot's home like an old friend. He had probably been surprised to see her. Maybe even happy. After all, he thought she was dead. He thought he was safe. They had shared a glass of wine in his beautiful cellar, and then she had shown him exactly what 10 years of rage looked like. The search for Sarah Mitchell intensified. Claire released her photo to law enforcement agencies across the region with a simple warning. Wanted for questioning in connection with a homicide. Approach with caution. For 3 days, there was nothing. Then a tip came from a small town in Vermont. A woman matching Sarah's description had been seen at a diner on the highway. Claire drove through the night, arriving at dawn. The diner was empty except for a single figure in a corner booth, staring out the window at the rising sun. Sarah Mitchell didn't run when Claire walked in. She didn't resist when Claire sat down across from her. She looked older than her photograph, worn down by years of hiding and hatred. But her eyes were calm. Peaceful, even. She had known this moment would come. She had accepted it. Claire read her rights as she snapped the handcuffs into place. Sarah listened without speaking, without fighting. On the way to the police cruiser, she stopped and looked back at Claire. "He took everything from me," she said quietly. "My money, my daughter, my life. I gave him 10 years. That was more than he deserved." In the interrogation room, Sarah told the whole story. How she had discovered Elliot's scheme. How he had manipulated her into disappearing. How she had spent years watching him play the saint while she lived in the shadows. She had tried to move on, to forget, but she couldn't. Every time she saw his face on the news, accepting another award, cutting another ribbon, the rage returned. Finally, she had decided. She would give him one chance to make it right. One chance to confess, to return what he had stolen, to face what he had done. She had gone to his home with that hope. But Elliot had laughed. He had told her nobody would believe a dead woman. So she had done what needed to be done. Sarah Mitchell was charged with second-degree murder. The trial lasted 3 weeks and became a national sensation. The prosecution painted her as a vengeful killer who had stalked her victim for years. The defense told a different story, a story of manipulation, theft, and a woman driven to despair by a man who had taken everything. In the end, the jury found her guilty of manslaughter, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances while still holding her accountable for taking a life. She was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Claire attended the sentencing. She watched as Sarah was led away in handcuffs, her face expressionless, her shoulders straight. There was no satisfaction in this, Claire realized. No justice. Just a sad, messy end to a story that should never have begun. Elliot Vance was buried in the Westbrook cemetery beneath a headstone that called him a beloved benefactor. His foundation was dissolved. His victims never got their money back. Most of them never even knew they had been victims. They continued to believe that Elliot had helped them, that he was a good man who had been taken too soon. Claire returned to her office and closed the file on the silent partner, as the media had dubbed him. She sat in the silence she had once hated and thought about Sarah Mitchell sitting in a cell, about Elliot Vance lying in his grave, about all the people whose lives had been twisted together by greed and lies. The rain had stopped. The sun was setting over the lake where Elliot had lived and died. Claire picked up her coffee cup, now cold, and made a decision. Tomorrow, she would request a transfer back to Boston. Westbrook was too quiet. And in the quiet, she could still hear the echo of two crystal glasses toasting in a wine cellar, just before everything went wrong.